Now, of course, they say a week is a long time in politics, but I have to tell you, for Anthony Albanese, I suspect this week has felt like a lot more than just a long time. We are now a week into this campaign, there's 5 to go, and if I were Mr Albanese, or anyone else in the Labor Party for that matter, I'd be getting a serious urge to pull the sheets over my head and cry. It's hard really to overstate just how bad this week was for Mr Albanese. Now, we all know how it started. He didn't know the cash rate nor the unemployment rate, and many people have tried to frame this as a gotcha question. The only point of the question, they say, was to trip Albo up. But it's not a gotcha question, because there should be nothing on which to trip him up. I mean, you'll remember earlier in the year when Scott Morrison was quizzed about how much a loaf of bread and a litre of milk and all of this business costs. That is a gotcha question. There's no doubt about that. Everyone knows the Prime Minister doesn't do his own groceries or fill up his own car, and Australians are quite comfortable with that. I mean, we'd much rather he spend his time worrying about the country than how much he's paying for bread. That little sideshow didn't cut through with voters for that reason. But Albanese, not knowing the cash rate or the unemployment rate, has cut through. And it's simple, really. Everyone in this country has to engage with the housing market. Either you have a mortgage, or you have children who have a mortgage, or you live in a rental property which is owned by someone who bought it on a loan. So the cash rate is not just some abstract number, it is a figure that has extraordinary influence over pretty much everyone in this country. Now, if you're struggling to pay the bills now and interest rates are likely to go up, that's extra stress on your bottom line. If your landlord's interest bill goes up, who do you think he's going to get the money from? This is a real issue. And the same goes for the unemployment rate. Everyone either has a job or wants a job, or has children or grandchildren who want a job. I mean, these are numbers that mean something to everyday Australians. They are numbers on which substantial amounts of Labor policy have been and will be based. So for Albanese to not know those numbers says two things to the electorate. One, he's not in touch with the issues that matter to Middle Australia, which is a big problem for a bloke leading the Workers' Party. And two, he's not across his brief. Now, that became more evident as the week wore on. Monday, it's the rates. Wednesday, he walks out of a press conference after just 8 minutes when the questions get tricky.
And we should make sure that we do that.
Thanks very much. Thanks for taking all questions, Mr Albanese. Why aren't you taking all the questions like your
still haven't answered the job seeker stuff.
So we're not taking your questions now, Mr Albanese, like you pledged.
Before that, he said he'd take all questions from journalists and he wouldn't run away from press conferences like he accused Scott Morrison of doing. And I have to show you this front page from the West Australian on Thursday, because it just nailed how bad this week has been for Albanese. On Thursday, he claimed that turning back boats meant we didn't need offshore detention. Then he had to walk back that claim and say that Labor did in fact support offshore detention. On Friday, Mean Girl Katie Gallagher had to clarify that when Albanese said his plan to spend $135 million setting up 50 urgent care clinics had been fully costed, it had, in fact, not been fully costed. This was made even more embarrassing by the fact that this announcement was meant to be something of a reset after Albo's terrible start to the week and lend some economic bolstering to their proposals. And he was at it again today. Here he is, being asked if Labor supports temporary protection visas.
Do you remain committed to Operation Sovereign Borders? And if so, do you support the retention of temporary protection visas?
Yes.
Then he said he didn't hear the question and Labor's policy was actually to not support temporary protection visas. I mean, honestly, it's hard not to feel a little bit sorry for Albanese. Day after day, he's being made to look like a fool in front of the voting public. And for what, according to the polls at least, should have been an easy run for Labor, this is making the task of winning ever more difficult. And people within the party know it. James Campbell's exclusive in the News Corp papers yesterday laid bare the anger and concern inside the ALP. People inside the party said Albanese was, quote, infamous for not properly reading his policy briefings, and he surrounded himself with too many inexperienced advisors. One person said morale within the ALP had fallen apart, and a Labor MP described the first week of the campaign as a shit show. Meanwhile, Morrison has been swanning around, going to the Easter show and generally having a good time, because he, at the very least, is able to answer the questions put to him. Now, the Coalition can't get too cocky about this. There are still 5 weeks to go and anything could happen in those 5 weeks. But it seems clear that Albanese is not match fit. The events of the past week have set the tone for this campaign, and Albanese will have to work extremely hard if he is to reverse that. Now, last week, Chris pointed to the bookies as an indication of the national mood, and at that time, the Coalition was paying $3.10 to win the election. Today, they were paying $2.25. It's a fair old shortening of those odds. Who knows what they'll look like next week?